welcome to the next session of the Gospel of Mark. In this session, we're going to look at several miracles of Jesus that demonstrate the power of God's kingdom. We're going to be picking up the record in Mark chapter 4, and we're going to look beginning at verse 35. And on that day, it says here, when evening had come, this is Jesus speaking, he said to them, which was his disciples and his 12 apostles who were with him, because in the previous session, we left off where Jesus was at the Sea of Galilee, and he was on a boat, and he was teaching large crowds in parables. And then afterward, he would go with his disciples and the 12 apostles, and he would talk with them privately and explain those parables to them. So then on that day, they were near the Sea of Galilee, the lake there, and Jesus says to them, "Let's cross over to the other side of the lake." And leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were going along with him. And a great windstorm rose up, and the waves were breaking over the side of the boat, so much so that the boat was already filling up, and he was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are about to die?" And Jesus got up, and he subdued the wind and said to the sea, "Silence, be still." And the wind ceased, and it became completely calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no trust?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, Who is this, that even the wind and the lake obey him?" So there's this great storm, and Jesus calms the storm. They're crossing over on the Sea of Galilee to the other side. And there's boats that are going with him. And did they know that this storm was going to crop up? Maybe. Maybe not. But they find themselves in the midst of a storm. This might generate to the reader of the first century, perhaps, ideas about the prophet Jonah. You could do that for modern readers too. But the idea of Jonah sailing away on a ship and then encountering a storm. But this story goes completely differently than that. Now, the storm and the waves, they start overtaking the side of the boat, and the boat becomes filled with water. And Mark uses this kind of language here that Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on the cushion. Jesus, probably exhausted from all the teaching and everything he had been doing, was resting, sleeping in the stern. While the boat is rocking, while the waves are splashing, how is this? I think any reader would kind of just wonder, what is the catch? Well, his disciples get to the point where they're so worried, they go wake him up. And they don't just wake him up and tell him, oh my gosh, what's going on? They say, "Teacher." They talk to Jesus and they say, "Teacher, do you not care that we are about to die?" It's as though Mark is setting the story where all this calamity and chaos is happening around them, and Jesus is peaceful and resting. And then when the disciples wake him, they are upset. And they talk to Jesus as though he doesn't care. And that's completely not true. But as the narrative is unfolding, that's the way it's couched. And so then Jesus gets up and he basically just dispels the storm. He tells it to be quiet and to silence, be quiet, and then to be still. 2 commands, and he solved the problem. And then what does he do? He turns, and Mark says here, he says to his disciples, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no trust?" This is important because throughout each one of these miracles that we're going to look at in this section, they all deal with demonstrating the power of God's kingdom, and which is meant to elicit trust in the individuals, and particularly in the reader. Now here, after Jesus demonstrates this power over nature, that he has received this divinely bestowed power to calm the seas, the very sea itself, basically a power over the elements of creation. It challenges the disciples. Jesus, when he turns to them and says, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no trust?" He's challenging them to have a different frame of mind about the experience. And as we're reading this, as a reader, we also are to see the challenge to ourselves as we're thinking through this and reading these circumstances here in this incident. Who is this Jesus who is able to do this, is what the disciples ask. And it's what the reader can ask as well, as Mark is unfolding what it means for Jesus to be this chosen, anointed Son of God who's been given the power and authority of God's kingdom. And now he is enacting that through these miracles. And this particular one, where he is showing that he has authority over nature, that Jesus is not just some teacher, he's not just a Jewish rabbi, and he's not even just a prophet. He is exercising a unique authority from God that he has received, and he is demonstrating the power of God's kingdom through that. Well, moving into chapter 5, as they're on the lake, the Sea of Galilee, they're moving across it, they encountered a storm, and then here, as they came to the other side, so they're traveling across the lake from east to west. So they're somewhere over in this area on the west side, and they're moving over here to the east side. And it says that they were going into the region of the Gerasenes, which is not known exactly where that's at. It's somewhere along the east side of the Sea of Galilee. Verse 2, and when Jesus, when he came up out of the boat, so they pull up onto shore, they disembark, and immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him, who lived in the tombs, and no one was able to bind him anymore, not even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Mark makes a very elaborate point here about this individual. The first thing is that, a man, he lives in the tombs, he lives in the graveyard, and it says that he had an unclean spirit. So a man with an unclean spirit met Jesus, and then he goes in to describe this man. This man was so strong, nobody could bind him, nobody could subdue him. And that's going to be important. Nobody could subdue him. And every day and night in the tombs and in the mountains, he was crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down Now, in the previous one, it says here that a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. This is kind of like a summary statement of the incident, because the man is not there with Jesus yet. Mark is just setting up the scene, and he's showing that Jesus has left the boat, and when Jesus left the boat, a man met him. Now, who is this man, and how did the rest of this kind of like transpire? So then he goes in to describe the man, and then he describes the man's action here when he came to Jesus. So the man with the unclean spirit sees Jesus from a distance, and it says he ran and bowed down before him. He ran and bowed down before him, crying out with a loud voice. The man who was demon-possessed said, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I demand that you swear under oath by God, do not torment me." The man with the evil spirit ran. He ran to Jesus, and he bowed before Jesus. This is indicating a recognition of authority. And this is what the evil spirits have done before, is that they will bow before Jesus because they understand there's a differential in power and authority, where Jesus is wielding the power of God's kingdom, and they know it, and they are afraid. And so they bow before Jesus as a way to show respect for that authority. Here, this demoniac, the guy possessed with the demon, the spirit says to Jesus, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" He immediately identifies him. This is part of Mark's gospel that we've seen before, is that the evil spirits, they know who Jesus is. But the general audience and public and the people around him are still trying to figure it out. And this can provide some of what we learned about regarding narrative tension, where the reader of the gospel is privy to this information early on, but then as the gospel unfolds, people continually question, who is Jesus? What is this man from Nazareth? But the spirits, the unclean, the evil spirits, they know exactly who he is. And here, interestingly, the demon, this unclean spirit, he actually makes a demand of Jesus. He demands, he actually demands that Jesus swear under oath by God, which is something that is not to be done in the Old Covenant law. You weren't supposed to swear by any name or anything in heaven or on earth. He says, "Do not torment me." Now, in a narrative aside, Mark continues in verse 8 saying, because, he said this because he had said to him, so Jesus had said to the demon-possessed man, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." So there's a little bit of a chronological disorder here, out of order, where the unclean spirit is speaking to Jesus, and then Mark narrates kind of where that came from. It came from Jesus telling the man or the spirit to come out of him. So then Jesus asked him, the man, which he's actually speaking to the unclean spirit in the man, "What is your name?" And he said to him, the demon-possessed man or the unclean spirit said to him, "My name is Legion, because we are many." And he kept begging him. So the unclean spirit kept begging Jesus that he would not send them out of the region. Interesting that that's the request that the unclean spirit makes. Don't send us out of the region. Well, in the ancient world, there was a lot of thought around spiritual beings and demons and things like that, spirits, that they were territorial, that demons or spirits would govern a particular land. Maybe that's part of Mark's picture here that he's trying to convey. But nevertheless, the point that we see here is the demons know they are going to be defeated. And so they don't want to be sent out of the region, so they ask for a plea. They ask here, in verse 11, it says, now there's a large herd of pigs was there, feeding on the mountainside, and they begged him. So now it switches, because it's now revealed that the unclean spirit is not one, but many, whose name is Legion. And so they begged him, Jesus, saying, send us into the pigs so that we may enter into them. So the demons are okay being cast out of the person as long as they get to go into these pigs. What's the purpose of that? Let's keep reading. And Jesus, he allowed them. And the unclean spirits came out and entered into the pigs. And the herd of about 2,000 pigs rushed down the steep bank into the lake and drowned in the lake. Wow, what a turn of events. The demons leave of their own accord. Jesus allowed them. Essentially, Jesus conceded to their request. Okay, you want to leave this man? You can go into these pigs? Fine, so be it. And they left and went into the pigs, and what happened? The pigs ran down the slope into the lake, the Sea of Galilee, and drowned. I think what this scene is sort of like trying to present here, that Mark is showing this encounter between Jesus and not just one evil spirit like he has before, but he's up against a whole crew of them. He's up against Legion. Maybe 1,000 of them. We don't know. There are 2,000 pigs. If there's one spirit per pig, that's 2,000 spirits. We don't know if there's any one-to-one correlation or not. But that's a lot of pigs, and they all kind of go crazy and run down the side of the slope into the sea or into the lake and die. One thing that this does convey is Jesus' authority over the spirit realm. And not just that, not just because he in the past he's able to cast evil spirits or demons out of people. Here, the demon leaves, but then ultimately where they go ends up in destruction. The pigs go down the side of the hill and die. That's the end of what we understand about the spirits. But it seems to be picturing an ultimate demise, that there's no compromise. Even if Jesus let them escape to the pigs, they eventually found themselves destroyed. This could be kind of proleptic, or what it means is sort of like forecasting the ultimate demise and defeat of Satan's realm with Jesus at the end of the gospel, which we'll get to. But what happens after the pigs die? Well, it says, and the men who were looking after them, the herders, they fled and they reported it into the city and the countryside. So they go out and they start announcing it to everybody. And the people went to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the man who had been afflicted by a demon, he who previously had legion, sitting, clothed, and in his right mind. And they were afraid. In the previous story of the disciples with Jesus on the Sea of Galilee in the storm, the disciples were also afraid. This is a recurring motif when people see the power of God at work, in the kingdom, the power of God's kingdom at work. And it says in verse 16, and those who had seen what had happened to the man afflicted by a demon described it to him. So they recount what happened. and also told them about the pigs. So not just the way that the man was made whole and delivered from the demon possession, but then the destruction of the pigs. And they began to beg him to depart from their territory. The demon legion, asked Jesus not to send them out of the region or the area. And now, after Jesus delivers this demon-possessed man, and the pigs end up, run into the sea and die into the lake, and then the people, they ask Jesus to leave. And we don't know if this is because of the pigs or it's because of the man who is now in his right mind, who for so long had been unable to be subdued and would cry out in the wilderness and cut himself with stones. Whatever it was, the people in that area on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, they didn't want Jesus there anymore. They wanted him to leave the area. It's an interesting sort of twist and switch where the spirits didn't want to leave, but now the people there want Jesus to leave. So he does. Verse 18, and as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been afflicted by the demon was begging him to go with him. But he, Jesus, did not let him. Instead, he said to him, go to your house, to your people, and tell them all the Lord has done for you, and that he had mercy on you. So he, the man who was healed of the demon possession, he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. Again, a very similar sort of reaction to what the disciples had. After Jesus calmed the storm on the Sea of Galilee, they were amazed. They asked themselves, who is this guy that the wind and the waves obey him? And here, after the man who had been healed from demon possession went around and told everybody about what Jesus had done, they couldn't believe it either. They were amazed. Now, this area of the Decapolis over here, there's a large area here on the eastern side of the Jordan River called the Decapolis because it was known for 10 large Roman cities or prominent Roman cities, so it's the Decapolis, named after Deca for the number for 10 in Greek, and polis, the word for city. So it's the 10 cities. These are all predominantly Gentile cities. This was not Israel. This is not where Israelites lived. This is not the area of Judea or Galilee. So the people here are Gentiles. What is most shocking about this story is that Jesus goes across the lake to Gentile territory. He is then met by a man who lives in the graveyard or around the tombs. And then there are pigs nearby. For a first century Jewish reader, you would want to ask, what is Jesus doing there? All three of these things are taboo. They are what make a Jewish man unclean. To be with Gentiles, to be around graves and dead bodies, to be near pigs. Now, obviously, touching them is the problem. Touching dead bodies, touching pigs and things. But just the proximity probably would make a first century reader nervous, first century Jewish reader nervous. And so when Jesus here at the end, when Jesus tells the man to go and to tell everybody what the Lord has done for you, this is sort of ironic because in the past there have been multiple times that Jesus forbids people from announcing what he has done. And we'll see that here come again in the next scene that we're going to see. So why now? Why here is Jesus saying, no, it's good, go tell everybody? One thing we could pick up is due to these circumstantial factors of where Jesus is. He's over in Gentile territory, the Decapolis. And so over there, they don't have the same idea of a Messiah that the people of Judea, the Israelites in Judea and Galilee and everything, that they have. So one thing we could probably pick up is that there are unique circumstances here that perhaps this fits with Jesus' mission, or at least it could be foreshadowing, perhaps, the future Gentile mission of Jesus' church, especially with the growth of the kingdom from the parables that we read about, that the kingdom is going to grow and spread and become a great living thing. All right, so verse 21, chapter 5 says, let's move into the next scene here. And it says, and when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, so they were over here on the east side of the Sea of Galilee here in the area of the Gergesenes. They get in the boat, they go back over to the west side over here. And when they get there, it says, a large crowd gathered around him, and he was by the lake. So he's on the lake on the west side to begin with, crosses over, encounters a storm, gets to the east side, encounters this demoniac, this guy who's possessed by Legion, gets in a boat, then goes back to the west side of the lake, and then is still there by the lake. He's just going back and forth across the lake here. So he gets there, and this is what transpires. And one of the leaders of the synagogue, this is interesting, a leader of the synagogue. This is a high-ranking Jewish leader in the community named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and earnestly begged him. So this is also reminiscent of the demoniac we just read, that the demoniac ran and bowed down before Jesus and began begging him. So here, Jairus, the Jewish synagogue leader, comes, falls at Jesus' feet, and earnestly begged him, saying, my little daughter is close to dying. Come, lay your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. And when Jesus went with him. So Jesus went with Jairus, and a large crowd was following him and crowding around him. Now, there's another interesting literary device here I want to introduce you to. It's called intercalation. Intercalation is known as a sandwiching effect. And it's common in the Gospel of Mark. We'll encounter it a few more times. But essentially what it is you have one story that's currently running, one narrative, and then it gets interrupted by a second story. And then when that story ends, the first story is then again resumed. The technique, intercalation, is, to be sure, this is a quote from James Edward article, Mark and Sandwiches, the technique, intercalation, is, to be sure, a literary technique, but its purpose is theological. That is, the sandwiches emphasize the major motifs of the gospel, especially the meaning of faith, discipleship, bearing witness, and the dangers of apostasy. Moreover, I shall endeavor to show that the middle story nearly always provides the key to the theological purpose of the sandwich or of the intercalation. The insertion interprets the flanking halves. To use the language of medicine, the transplanted organ enlivens the host material. So the intercalation or the sandwiching, in story one, typically there's a normal narrative that's developing, and then often something sudden or unexpected happens, and the story cuts. And then the second story begins, and it digresses, and an entirely different narrative unfolds, And there's often at the end a moral lesson. And then story 1, it kind of segues back, and then story 1 resumes. And then story 1 often concludes with a moral lesson that typically ties both stories together. So, we were just reading that Jesus got to the west side of the lake, and the leader of the synagogue, Jairus, comes and tells him that his daughter's sick and is dying, is at the death's door, so to say, and he wants Jesus to come and to heal her. And so Jesus then goes with him, and a crowd is with him, and the crowd is pressing around. And then there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Enter story number 2. And had suffered greatly while under the care of many physicians. And she had spent all that she had and was not any better, but rather grew worse. This is all narrative that Mark is including so that we know who this woman is. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. Because she kept saying, if I just touch his garment, I will be healed. And immediately the flow of her blood dried up, and she knew in her body that she was healed of her affliction. And immediately, Jesus, knowing in himself that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, who touched me? And he, Jesus, looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, being afraid and trembling, probably because she did not want to be discovered, but again, being afraid, another theme that connects all these stories together. So she's afraid and she's trembling. Knowing what had happened to her, she came and fell down before him. Coming and falling before Jesus ties all 3 of these accounts together. And she told Jesus the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your trust has healed you. Go in peace and be healthy and free from your addiction, or from your affliction. Jairus, the synagogue leader's daughter, was sick. And that story gets interrupted for this woman who was sick. Jesus identifies her as daughter as well. And there are some other connections that I want to mention, but we need to keep reading and resume back to story 1 to see them. So while he was still speaking, this is the segue back to story number 1. While Jesus was still speaking to the woman, some people came from the leader of the synagogue's house saying, Jairus, your daughter has died. Why bother the teacher any further? But Jesus, overhearing what they said, he said to the leader of the synagogue, do not be afraid. There's that theme again. The people are afraid, but Jesus tells them, don't be afraid. When he's in the boat, he's like, why are you afraid? Here, Jairus' daughter has just died. And Jesus tells Jairus, don't be afraid. Just believe. The word believe here is the same word as trust. And he did not allow anyone to follow along with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, and he saw much commotion and people crying and wailing loudly. This was the common thing to do when you had someone in your family die, is you would have people, neighbors, you would have them make a ruckus and wail loudly to let people know that you were grieving, that something awful had happened, and great sadness was upon your house. So Jesus gets to their house, and these people are just wailing, and there's all this commotion. And when he entered in, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and crying? The child has not died, but is asleep." Now, the child did die, but Jesus is telling them this as a way to make it a euphemistic statement, but also to kind of like preempt the resurrection that is going to be coming in the next part of the scene. So they began to laugh at him. They didn't believe him. They knew the daughter was dead, so they mocked him. But after clearing them out of the house, Jesus got him out because he was going to do something that was going to be so shocking, they were not going to be there to witness it. So he took the child's father, her mother, and those who were with him, and they went into the room where the child was. And taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, and this is the translation that Mark offers, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately, the little girl, and then here's the narrative aside that links this with the previous story 2 in the intercalation. For she was 12 years old. This little girl got up and began to walk. And what happened? What was the reaction? The same. They were greatly amazed. Unbelievable. And now, verse 43 says, "And he strictly ordered that no one should know about this. And he told them to give her something to eat." It's not enough that he raises her from the dead, but in order to kind of like drive that point home, he's like, "Oh, and give her some food too. She might be hungry." The little girl here, this you could translate the Talitha cum as a little girl or his daughter. It's an endearing term. The woman with the issue of blood, Jesus referred to as daughter. She had an issue for 12 years of bleeding, and then she gets healed, and Jairus is with her, or with Jesus when he heals her. And then now he comes to Jairus' home and raises his daughter from the dead, and his daughter was 12 years old. This is the intercalation linking between these stories. And they were greatly amazed. And here, remember, we talked about this thing called the messianic secret in previous sessions where Jesus tells specifically evil spirits, but also people, not to tell anyone about the healing that they had received. Here he tells the family, the mother and father, Jairus and his wife, not to tell anybody about this. How is that possible? As a reader, we're looking at this scene, and are they going to keep this girl indoors all the time? Are they going to have to hide her if anybody comes over? Because the moment somebody sees her alive, everybody's going to know about it. Well, we're not told the specifics of how this is supposed to work out in reality, but as a narrative device trying to produce this tension in the storyline, Jesus is trying to hamper the recognition of what he has done at this time. And there's a couple different reasons perhaps for that, which I cover in previous sessions. But here, on this high note, Jesus ends these miracle stories and shows the power of God's kingdom in operation through his ministry. In the next session, we're going to continue learning about the kingdom of God in the life and ministry of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark.